Propaganda still exists in the world, but also in the West. How are we influenced by our media? Let's understand the world a little better. With me is Professor Dannagal Young. She studies the content, audience, and effects of political information and has written two books, Irony and Outrage, and just released Wrong: How Media, Politics, and Identity Drive Our Appetite for Misinformation. Would you consider political satire or commentary as propaganda?
What a great question to start off. I would say it certainly can be. Political satire can certainly be propaganda. It In some ways it depends on how it is received by the audience. Satire is interesting, especially ironic satire, because it is cognitively complex and it's often very difficult. We don't think of it as difficult, but the process neuropsychologically of unpacking and understanding satire actually requires a lot of what I call mental gymnastics. And depending upon how it is received and depending upon what the content of that satire is, it could be propaganda. So, first, I guess it would require that we think about what is propaganda. And, interestingly, centuries ago, the term propaganda was not something that had a negative connotation. The
Mhm.
term propaganda came from the concept of propagating the faith. So that notion of propagation from agriculture, and this was really in reference to the spread of the good word, right? The spread of Christianity. And so the notion of propaganda was simply introducing regular people to the idea of Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. That is the original concept of propaganda. It really wasn't until the advent of mass media that we really have a shift in how we start to think about that, what you could think of as propagation of ideas in a negative way. And now we think of it in the context of deception, manipulation, usually some kind of dishonesty. And I would say propaganda often includes not just deception or manipulation, but usually some kind of covert effort by the message sender to hide their genuine intention.
Mhm.
So a lot of times public relations where the actual intention of the message sender is not necessarily known to the audience. A lot of times I would consider that kind of messaging to be propaganda. And propaganda also deliberately serves the goals of the message sender while obscuring who that message sender or producer really is. So sometimes satire falls into that category, but a lot of times the satirist is him or herself poking fun, making a joke, being critical of some institution, and they're doing it for themselves. And they're not doing it in a clandestine way for some higher up or from some other agent. So, in that regard, it might not necessarily constitute propaganda. If,
Mm.
however, the satirist is doing the bidding of some other entity and is in the process of their joke being deceptive, being manipulative, obfuscating actual facts and reality, that would be propaganda.
Okay, but would you say that, let's say in the US, big corporations, big media corporations, are privately owned and not necessarily public? I don't know if there are also public companies, but for example, Fox News, we've had Tucker Carlson at Fox News, who is a political commentator, and he knows his audience. Would assume so. He doesn't just say probably his own ideas, but also what his audience also agrees with, because that gets the money, right? That gets the corporation money.
Great point. And so in terms of propaganda, the for Tucker Carlson, for that example, that is what's very difficult in these examples is that we never really know what a message creator truly believes. We never know if the things that they're saying are things that they actually believe to be true. This, by the way, is why it became so problematic when Tucker Carlson's texts were revealed through that giant lawsuit with was it Smartmatic or Dominion? It was the Dominion lawsuit where all of Tucker Carlson's internal text messages with other people at Fox News were revealed through some of those disclosures. And it was clear that, for example, he believed that that woman, Sidney Powell, who was the source of a lot of the misinformation about the Dominion voting machines, that Tucker Carlson thought that she was bananas. He didn't think that she was being honest. It was clear that he saw the election lie for what it was and yet continued to perpetuate those falsehoods. So that to me is interesting. In terms of what master he serves, that's very interesting because I think that at Fox News in particular, we know, for example, that they do have solid news organizations who do journalism. They had an election reporting desk that was in the business of reporting truth, but their money, their profit comes from the analysis and opinion shows that air between 8 and 11 p.m. on the network. So because that is where their money comes from, and those shows are not beholden to truth in the same way that traditional journalism is. They are really dependent upon those shows, which I would say do fall more in the category of propaganda because they really are. They're often deceptive, often manipulative, often hiding from the audience the fact that the reason that they do what they do is not necessarily because it is good for democracy or true, but it is what is going to make the most money for the network.
And that is something that doesn't just hold true for Fox News, right? I mean,
Absolutely right.
political satire probably also generates more money, I would
Absolutely
assume,
right.
than the normal news, right?
Absolutely right. I don't know. That's a great question. I think it depends on where you're looking. If you're looking at something like The Daily Show or John Oliver, which is on HBO, I am not sure how those profits compare because those are quite niche outlets. Like compared to like a CNN or a network news program, for example. So I'm not necessarily sure how those profits compare. But you're absolutely right that all of these are, and this is an issue with political media content across the board in the United States, outside of national public radio and public television, which are viewed by significantly less people in the United States than public broadcasting across developed democracies around the globe. Okay. Outside of those, our media in the United States, our political media, are owned by private corporations whose, if they are publicly traded, which most of them are, that means that their responsibility is to shareholders who are, buying and selling stock. You got to make sure that you turn a profit. So, what is governing the production of political information in the United States is by and large profit, cost cutting measures, and profit motives. And that's not necessarily something that is going to serve democratic health, but that's often something that is going to appeal to some of our baser instincts.
So probably more entertaining and or not just informative, but kind of mixture between the two.
Right. And not just entertaining. And this is something that I've written about more recently that, there's a real synergy that exists right now in the United States between the nature of our political culture and the logics and economics of our media environment. So let me just, in contrast, let's go back for a second to the 1980s. In the 1980s, you had very early cable, okay? But let's say the 1970s, early 1980s, where most people are watching one of three major networks of television, ABC, CBS, and NBC. A lot of that content is homogenous. People are watching national network news. It's quite homogenous in emphasis and topic, okay? But you're also, in terms of the political backdrop, you're talking about a time of relatively high trust in government, high trust in media, relatively, decent voter turnout. The big issue for me is that it was also an era when political polarization at the elite level was not what we see it as today. So you still in the 1970s and 80s had Democrats and Republicans who were voting for legislation that had been introduced by members of the other party. You also had members of both parties who were ideologically not quite as extreme as they are today. You had a real mix ideologically. And most important, based on the work that I'm doing now, is in the 1970s and 80s, those two major parties were far more heterogeneous in terms of their socio-demographics than they are today. So you had a Republican Party that had different kinds of people, different religions, maybe a little bit liberal ideologically, mostly conservative ideologically, but a mix. You also had people that lived in rural and urban areas and suburbs. Same with the Democratic Party, quite a mix across all of those aspects of socio-demographics. The shift that the US has seen over the last 50 years includes shifts in all of those metrics I've described. So now we have dismally low trust in institutions and government, which is something that we find across Western democracies as a whole. We have really intense ideological polarization among elites. So in Congress, members of those parties very, very rarely, if ever, will vote for something introduced by the other side. And usually they're trying to engage in the most extreme options possible to stop the other side from even advancing legislation or policy. You also have among the public intense hostility, especially on the margins of those parties, intense hostility to members of political outgroups, far more so than we saw in the 70s and 80s. And that social sorting piece that's key here, that really took place over the last 40 or 50 years, where the Democratic Party has become more secular, agnostic, urban, racially more diverse, ethnically more diverse. What was the other one? Oh, more educated. So our more educated voters tend to vote Democratic. So there's all these interesting socio-demographic correlates of party ID. And on the other side, the Republican Party has become more homogenous. So more white, evangelical Christian, rural, and ideologically conservative. And we do find that our less educated voters, and this is quite an interesting shift too, less educated voters are far more likely to vote Republican now. Now that's interesting because that was always complicated by working class union membership, etc. But now what we have is, especially in the case of the Republican Party, in the hands of the Make America Great Again movement, we have a real pairing of republicanism, support for Trump, and lower levels of education, which is interesting. So, all of that is to say that in today's media environment, where the parties are so distinct, there is very little trust. Members of opposing parties do not like one another. And identity is so huge because now political party stands for all these other things. If someone says to you, I'm a Republican, it, it it's not necessary that they are white, rural dwelling, culturally conservative, but it's pretty likely that they are in a way that wasn't true 40 or 50 years ago. In the media environment of today, which doesn't just have the three major networks, it has hundreds of cable channels, infinite outlets online, social media platforms that connect us based on what ignites our passions, right? What gets us angry or hopeful or threatened or nervous. Social identity is key. So being able to split people up into these distinct enclaves is what makes these media organizations huge amounts of money. When you split us up, you engage us emotionally, you activate the notion of social identity threat. That is what's going to get us paying attention. And that is what media organizations require for profit. So when we talk about, is it just that, the idea that these media organizations are privately owned means that the content will be entertaining? I wish it was just that. It's not just that. It's that because they're privately owned, the metrics that are governing how they function are metrics rooted in emotion. And emotion in the American political culture right now is best ignited through social identity and identity threat. So it's not just entertaining, it is a particular kind of outrage oriented content telling us who we should be worried about, who is going to destroy our way of life, what our team is about, what we stand for, the things that we should be worried about because they will take it away from us. Those are the kinds of aspects of content that are rewarded in this environment.
Wow. That was super. I actually one thing I realized there, or that came up to me, is you mentioned how there's lower level in trust in Western societies, not just in the U.S. And I think I read something similar to about Germany as well. I'm living in Germany, and we have the ZDF, for example, and other that are part of the Rundfunkgebühren and therefore part of the public media landscape. And they also have these political satire shows. And I also enjoy some of these, but they solely consist of saying what is bad about our government, for example, or the state we are in and everything around us. And as I was watching more of these, I felt for myself that I was getting more like, everything is bad. All the politicians aren't to be trusted. Who can I vote for? Yeah, the lesser evil. This You fall into this narrative, and still it is entertaining content or engaging content that I can say too. I wonder, in the U.S., is there also within the public media landscape, is there also political satire or commentary?
What the last part? I missed the last part. Is there also political satire? What?
Or commentary, or these more emotion driven media content?
So what's interesting is that the tone of American political satire certainly changed when Trump was elected. Um, the, you know, the argument that I make in my first book is that as well, first of all, political satire tends to lean to the left and tends to come from the left. And that's not always universally true, but there are reasons I explain in that book why, in terms of political psychology, it would make sense. I advance an argument for why that is likely true, especially in the United States. And part of it is because people who are culturally liberal tend to be more tolerant of ambiguity. They're less likely to be monitoring for interpersonal threat in their environment. And so as a result, they're tolerant of ambiguity. They also have the luxury of being able to be high in need for cognition, which simply means they enjoy thinking for the sake of thinking. That doesn't mean they're smarter, it just means they enjoy thinking more. And when you look at the who consumes political satire in the United States, my work showed that yes, the people who are consuming especially ironic satire tended to be people who were high in tolerance for ambiguity and high in need for cognition. Now, on the other hand, people who are culturally conservative tend to be low in tolerance for ambiguity because they are monitoring for interpersonal threat. And if you're someone monitoring for interpersonal threat, you are not likely to be okay with an environment that is unpredictable and chaotic and
Mm.
uncertain. Okay. So, and these are individuals who, while they might still be very smart, they are less high in need for cognition because they want to make decisions efficiently and quickly, and they usually do so through emotions and heuristics. Um, if you are under conditions of threat, your survival depends on your ability to make decisions quickly and efficiently. And so that is what we tend to find among cultural conservatives. So the argument that I make is that the reason why in the United States we have opinion programming that is very outrage oriented, that is really didactic. It tells you who to be worried about, it tells you who the outgroup is, it tells you what's dangerous, and it tells you what to do about it in a very efficient way. Those programs are more likely to come from the right, and they are more likely to be appealing to people on the right. And I argue it is rooted in those psychological traits that we know are correlated with cultural conservatism. And on the left, if you are tolerant of ambiguity, there's amazing research that shows that people who are tolerant of ambiguity are more appreciative of abstract art. They're more appreciative of stories that have very ambiguous endings, right? Like those science fiction films where you're like, I have no idea if they live or die, right? Some people love that. And according to some of the work that's been done, in the US, cultural conservatives ought to hate that, but cultural liberals would appreciate it. So I build on that argument and propose that that helps explain the appeal of ironic satire, because its meaning is never explicitly stated. It's certainly not an efficient way to communicate, because usually you're saying the opposite of what you mean, and you're invoking all these different cultural references that the audience has to unpack. It's not it's certainly not efficient. It's not an efficient way to do business, right? And I argue that that is why it tends to be more likely to come from cultural liberals and be appreciated by cultural liberals. So we do have that weird sort of ideological divide in our genres in the US. Okay. When Trump was elected, though, something interesting happened, and that was that a lot of our satire hosts began sort of abandoning their playfulness and becoming more serious and didactic, even outrageous in how they approach their topics. And to me, this makes sense because you can only be playful if you are not under conditions of threat. So if you think about the notion that the reason that cultural conservatives, I argue, are more likely to prefer genres that are efficient and didactic and threat oriented is because their physiological systems are more highly monitoring for interpersonal threat. So it makes sense for them. On the left, maybe you're not physiologically oriented to relate to the world in that way and monitor for threat all the time. However, a Trump victory in 2016, it seems like that could have been perceived as sort of an existential threat, because now this sort of, we had 8 years of Barack Obama, and you're just like assuming, okay, so gay marriage is legal, and don't ask don't tell is no longer governing gays in the military, and now we have a black president, and we're on this slow march towards progressivism. Well, the Trump election victory in 2016 was likely a huge threat to many cultural liberals. So it's not that surprising to me that under those conditions, those folks would, especially the liberal comics, would stop being really, really funny. And we would feel a lot more of that threat perception from them. We saw that from Stephen Colbert in his early days. We saw that from the comic Samantha Bee, who does not have a show on the air anymore. I There's no way to know for sure, but that is my sense that that is what happened in that time period. And truly, I don't think that our late night hosts, our late night comedy hosts in the US have really recovered or figured out what they are for right now. I don't know that they know what they're for right now.
uh, do you have any big publicly owned media in the US, and are they doing satire or commentary as well?
Great question. The US is so weird, and I did not know how weird it was until for my second book, I was looking into some of the international research on the ideological makeup of different audiences. And it's very bizarre. Uh, we don't have a huge, robust public media infrastructure in the United States. We just don't. We have, as I said, we have National Public Radio, which has affiliates in, all around the country. Okay, but that's one radio station with affiliates all around the country. And that it is called publicly funded, but the amount of money that it receives from the federal government is minuscule. It is really funded by viewer donations, by what are called like memberships. Like I'm a sustaining member of my local National Public Radio affiliate. Um, it's also supported by corporate underwriting. So corporations give large donations to support public media. There's an irony there, is there not? And then there is the public television, which is not hugely consumed, quite frankly. It's really not. Now, do they have commentary? They do have some discussion shows. They will feature individuals who come on and will discuss from either side. What they don't have is the sort of like a Sean Hannity or a Tucker Carlson or like a Rush Limbaugh who just gets on and says their one point of view and rails in one direction. However, I will say when you look at the ideological leaning of the audience of National Public Radio in the United States, it is overwhelmingly liberal. Because of that, there are a lot of criticisms from conservatives about the government funding National Public Radio. Because the audience is so liberal, they make the argument that the content has a liberal bias. Now, I've seen some analyses of content of National Public Radio. It is more liberal than many of our privately owned media outlets, but I'm not sure how you establish baseline, like what is neutral objective content. So that's something that I'm interested in looking at, because just because the audience is overwhelmingly liberal, does that mean that the content itself is liberal? I don't know. I'm not sure.
Um, one question as towards propaganda that would interest me is actually if propaganda in the original word, at least, is not necessarily to be seen as something bad or evil, how would you see political satire and commentary? Do you think that is something that shouldn't be the way it is currently, that actually hurts us as a society, or do you think it's good because it actually attracts more viewers to political topics?
So my sense is that you're bringing my older work back to haunt me, because 20 years ago I wrote a lot about how I really found satire especially to be such a promising form of content, because it's a place where maybe younger people who aren't super interested in politics could go to learn about current events and learn about foreign policy in a way that's really fun and gets them engaged, perhaps in a way that they wouldn't without that kind of content. I used to tell my students it was like, feeding people spinach, but they don't know it's spinach because it's hidden inside chocolate cake. You can learn about, the events of the world, and you don't know that you're learning. Now, I had a colleague from the University of Texas, Rod Hart, who was writing around the same time as I, and he was far more negative about the potential for political satire to harm viewers, that it was so negative and so cynical. And his argument was that it would cause people to drop out of the political process because they would think, well, if all politicians are jerks and if all politicians are out for themselves, why am I even going to vote? Why am I even going to be involved? And a lot of my work at the time was showing, I did a lot of survey research, and it was showing that the people who were watching late night comedy shows were actually more likely to be participating in politics, talking about politics, consuming other forms of news. So I argued that illustrated that his argument was incorrect, right? Because if really late night comedy was and satire were causing people to become so cynical that they dropped out of politics, then those people wouldn't be watching the news. They wouldn't be talking about politics. And that's not what we found. But now that time has passed, I'm wondering if we might both have been right, because what I see when I look back at that data and I see the people who consumed a lot of satire like 20 years ago, they had especially low trust in government. They had especially low trust in politicians. They did, however, have high confidence in their ability to understand politics and make sense of politics and participate in politics. And I'm wondering if what I saw at the time was still evidence of that's okay, that's good for democracy, that's good for democratic health, because they're skeptical. They're not trusting, they're skeptical, but they're still participating. Um, at this point in time, given the combination of low trust plus polarization, plus people who look at members of the other party as less than human, right? Less human than members of our own party. I wonder if it's not just that cynicism is a potential outcome of satire, but that it not just cynicism towards public officials, but a real kind of hardening of our hearts towards the other side. And there is some work that shows that exposure to the satire, the liberal satire shows, is associated with political polarization, becoming more entrenched in your own views, going further in the direction of your own side, becoming more hostile towards the opposing party. That's not great. That's not something that we want. Now, when you look at the effects of exposure to what I call the outrage genre, that is, all those shows on Fox News that we talked about, the Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity. It's also that the Rush Limbaugh from the 1980s and 90s until he passed away a couple years ago. But also on the liberal side, you also have outrage content. People get mad at me when I say this. Liberals get mad at me when I say this. But Rachel Maddow is a kind of outrage host on the left. Those, Chris Hayes, they look and feel different, okay, than your Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity. And in fact, a content analysis in the book, The Outrage Industry, by professors at Tufts University, it does show that those MSNBC shows, the Rachel Maddow shows, the liberal outrage shows, they do include the aspects of outrage content, but not to the same extent as the conservative outrage shows. So the way that they say it, the conservative outrage shows are just empirically more outrageous. They include more of that language that's like, oh, it's a slippery slope. Things are getting terrible. More threatening language about outgroup threat. More like everything is going to hell in a handbasket language. More hyperbole, more exaggeration. So there's even an asymmetry in how the outrage programming works. But I'll be honest, it's all bad. None of it's great. Okay. I'll tell you something that I haven't talked about in any of my media interviews, which is I'm a tireless optimist. It makes my social scientist friends insane. Social scientists are a very pessimistic lot. If you study human beings, you become a pessimist. No offense to humans, but you do. You become a pessimist. But I am always optimistic, and I'll tell you what brings me optimism. If you look at some of the more popular shows that have emerged over the last few years, shows that just have tapped into something in the zeitgeist, we're looking at shows that do away with cynicism, do away with sarcasm, do away with meanness, do away with culture war bullshit in favor of empathy and unity. You look at a show like Schitt's Creek that came out of Canada that is about this rich, clearly liberal family that ends up in a rural town, and you would assume that they're going to show that the rural people are racist and homophobic, and none of that comes true in the show. The people are wonderful, they all become friends, and it's about the goodness of humanity. You look at the show Ted Lasso, another show which is about empathy and unity, which tapped into something that people were hungry for because it transcends all of these divisive social identities that all of these political media are trying to put us in these little boxes. And there seems to be a hunger for this transcendent content that it's not Pollyanna. It's not saying we're all the same. We have no differences. It's saying we're not the same. There are differences, but we can get along all the same. That is why I have optimism. Little things like that.
It's a beautiful message. But still, isn't that in a way when propaganda is basically, that's how I understood you, marketing for an idea? Isn't that in a way also propaganda?
Sure.
But
Sure.
not but bad propaganda necessarily. But I'm just asking since I
Yeah,
want to
no,
understand.
that's a great question. I think about this a lot. I work with health communication scholars a lot, and a lot of times what we're trying to figure out is how do we craft messages to reduce people's likelihood of engaging in risky behaviors, right? How do you craft messages to get college students to stop binge drinking, or how do you craft messages to get people to go get a prostate exam? Is that propaganda? Depending upon, I'll tell you what in my mind makes it not propaganda in those health communication contexts is usually you're pretty honest about your intent. You're like, here I am, I'm an organization that wants people to be healthy, and I think you should get a prostate exam so that you can get treated and, maximize your lifespan and your quality of life. And I'm going to give you factual information about what that we know based on medical research to try to convince you to go get a prostate exam. Now, is that propaganda? It doesn't seem deceptive. It's not manipulative, and the source is who the source says they are. Um, I don't know. I don't think that's propaganda. But what about something like what about when health communication scholars work with TV writers, which they do out in Los Angeles? There's a whole institute where health communication and public health experts work with TV and film writers to integrate accurate medical information and positive messaging into their content. What if there's a television show that has a plot line about vaccines? And maybe a mother is saying, I don't want to get my child vaccinated because I think vaccines cause autism. And the doctor in the show gives that mother a whole explanation of the research on how actually that's not true. That was one study and it was, you know, retracted. And here is all the evidence about the benefits of vaccines. And in fact, because people have opted out of vaccines, we've seen a resurgence in polio, in measles and mumps. Now, if all of those factual pieces of information are put into a television show that someone watches because they think they're just watching a TV show, is that propaganda? If the information is accurate to the best of our ability and it's in keeping with the consensus of the scientific community, but it is not made abundantly clear to the viewer that that episode was crafted in partnership with public health practitioners.
Is that you're also a comic? I've read, or an improv. You do improv,
Improv, yeah.
basically. So is that something? I don't know really how your improv looks, but is that something that you think about when in your shows or in your practice?
Not at all, actually. Right.
Not at all.
No, in fact, when I perform, I don't think about any of that stuff at all. And I think that this is one of the things that has helped me as I, study and write about satirists, is that if you approach the craft of comedy through the lens of how am I going to change people's minds about this issue, you're not going to be funny. Because if you lead with the goal of persuasion rather than being funny, you're never going to be funny. So when I do improv, I don't even feel like, I don't like, what is the argument that I'm making? Never, ever, ever. It's really just, is this a funny character? How do these people know each other? What's a fun relationship to tap into? What would people not expect to see in the context of a brother-sister relationship? What's something that might resonate with the audience's past experience? But it's never what will change their minds ever. It's like a whole different part of the brain, I feel like.
You think that counts for all comics? So also for, I mean, I don't know if he really is a comic, but the political satirists.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in a way, there are comics, right?
Sure,
So
sure.
you think? Interesting. Okay.
Well, no. Well, so let me be specific though, because I've heard Jon Stewart talk about this and Stephen Colbert as they talked about this. And just for full disclosure, I mean, it was 1,000 years ago, but I was a production assistant on The Daily Show for 10 days during the 2000 election when they were in Philadelphia. And I sat in on writers' meetings. And as Jon Stewart would say it back in the day, he has an itch and he's scratching it. So there are things that he's passionate about. There's things he's interested in. There's issues that are important to him. And his jokes are his way of, making light, bringing levity, and finding the funny in that thing. The fact that I, I think that he is honest when he says, when he used to say, I don't have a persuasion goal. My goal is not to persuade or change minds. I think that that is accurate. I think that's true. However, I don't think it's fair to say, which he used to say, I don't have an agenda. Because he definitely has an agenda. He had a point of view, he had a liberal ideology. So all of the itches that he was scratching were liberal itches. you know,
Understand.
I would call that an agenda. But being in the writer's room, it was clear they'd be like, okay, what is something at the top of the news today? Here's something that happened. What is the funny in that thing? That's always the lead. What is the funny in that thing? Here's the funny in that thing. Here's the irony in that thing. What is a turn of phrase that we could use that would be a fun juxtaposition that would make people laugh about that thing? It was never, what do we want our audience to learn from this thing? And it was never, what do we want our audience to believe about this thing?
Sadly, at this point, we lost connection once again and had to end the podcast. But if you want to know more about Dannagal and her insights, check out her just released book, Wrong: How Media, Politics, and Identity Drive Our Appetite for Misinformation. And thank you very much for watching.